Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Wally of the Jackson County Library Services. How are you doing today? Are you here for a story? I think this afternoon is a really good time for me to tell you the tale of the 3 bags of truth. And this is how the story goes. Once upon a time there was, and twice upon a time there wasn't, a king who lived in a faraway land. And this king, well, he had a thing for peaches. He loved peaches. He loved peaches probably more than anything in the whole wide world. Well, he probably loved his wife, the queen, and he loved his fluffy throne, and he most certainly loved his daughter, the princess, who was the most beautiful princess in all the land. But setting all that aside, it was peaches that really, truly ruled his world. Because every day he would get up in the morning and he would send for his couriers and have them bring, a peach, from the royal orchard. And after a while, that just wasn't enough. So he made a proclamation and he sent it out to all corners of his kingdom. And in the proclamation it said, "Whoever brings me the world's finest peach will have my daughter's hand in marriage." And with that, the word went out. It didn't take long for men from all parts of the kingdom and other nations from around the world to come bearing gifts for the king. And it wasn't just, the things that you would think a king would like, emeralds or furs or what have you. It was peaches. And the men would come and they would have their boxes and their crates and their baskets and their bowls lined with beautiful cloth, and in each of those was the most magnificent peach in the whole wide world. Well, maybe at least where they came from. So day by day, the line snaked from the throne through the court, through the castle, into the yard. And in that line were all these men who, they saw how beautiful the princess was, and they wanted her hand. So they stood there patiently until they had their turn in front of the king. And the king would ask them, "Well, what did you bring for me today?" Your sire, I bring you this magnificent peach." So he would take it and he would take a bite. Well, as I said, this king loved peaches. And I think if we really want to look at this hard, he was doing this because, again, he liked peaches. He wanted peaches of all kinds and all from everywhere. And he wasn't going to give up his princess for a peach. But every day he'd bite this peach and the other, and he would say, "Oh, this one's too hard," or "Oh, that's too sweet," or "Oh, this is too mushy," or "Oh, oof, oof, oof." No one ever brought to him what he considered the world's finest peach. Never mind that he probably had a mountain of peach pits sitting next to him. As I said, the word went out to all corners of the kingdom. And the word finally made its way out to this little farm way on the far side of practically of nowhere. And on that farm lived a little old lady and her 3 sons. And every day she'd go out and she'd water her peach tree. And it was a pretty magical mix of waters that she had inside her watering can, because, that peach tree didn't give much in the way of peaches, but every 7 years it gave the most magnificent peaches in all the land. So one day she had her oldest son get up. She said to him, "I need you to take this peach," and she picked one off the tree and she put it in a nice basket and covered it with nice cloth. And said, "I need you to take this peach to the king. I want you to earn the hand of the princess in marriage. It'd be great for our family." And the oldest son, proud, self-assured, thought himself handsome, he took off down the road. Well, he made his way down the road, and next to the road was sitting a woman, and an older woman, and she was rubbing her feet. And she had been traveling a while. She looked kind of tired and dusty. And she saw the youngest, or the oldest son rather, coming by, and she looked up and says, "Hello there, young man." I said, "Why are you in such a hurry? Where are you going? What do you have there in your basket?" And he just, and he was, kind of indignant that someone should get in his way as he made his way to the king's castle. And he says, "Nothing of your concern, old lady. This is a guy I have, just a bag of snakes." And he went on down the road. Well, he got to the king's castle, and he stood in that line with all the rest of the suitors, and slow but sure he made his way up to the throne. And the king looked down and says, "What do you have for me there, young man?" He says, "Well, I have a most magnificent peach for you, sire." And he opened up the basket, and out popped snakes, just tons of snakes. Well, they picked that son up, and they threw him outside of the castle and landed on the dirt. So he picked up his basket, made his way home, and told his mother what happened. Well, she didn't know what to think of that, but she got up the next day and she picked another peach, and she put that in a basket, nice cloth over it, and she gave it to the second oldest son. Well, the second oldest son, he was, kind of a wise guy, and he was happy-go-lucky, and he took that basket and he took his mother's blessing because he knew he was going to get the princess's hand. And he was walking down the road, and sure enough, there was that little old lady sitting next to the side of the road again, and she saw the young guy kind of like moving, just going down the road, and she says, "Whoa, hello, how are you, young man? How are you doing? Why are you in such a hurry? What do you got in the basket?" Well, he didn't have time to bother with some little old lady who was rubbing her feet, all dusty and everything. So I don't have time for you right now, so I'm going to go marry the king's daughter. I'm going to get the princess's hand. And you know what I have in this basket? I got a basket full of toads. Get out of my way. And so down the road he went. He got to the castle, and he stood in line with the rest of those suitors, and one by one, they went up to the king's throne, and he got up there, and the king looked down and said, "Well, there, young man, what do you have in that basket for me today?" "Sire, I have the most magnificent peach in all the land." And he opened up the basket, and out popped hundreds of frogs. Well, they picked him up, and they threw him outside of the castle, and he made his way back home. Had his head hang low. He wasn't quite so cocky anymore, and he told his mother what happened. She just shook her head, and she couldn't believe it. So what's up with these two fine sons of mine? And then the next morning she got up, and she picked that last peach, and it was all out of baskets and nice material. So she just put it in a tired old cotton bag, and she called her youngest son and said, "Take this peach to the king and see what you can do about winning the hand of the princess in marriage." The young son went out, she closed the door, and was kind of like done with that story. Well, he was, like I say, he was the youngest son, and he was happy-go-lucky, and he was, overlooked most of the time by those older brothers of his. But he had some smarts, and he may not have been appreciated, but he was also really kind. And he walked and walked and walked. He was in no hurry. He knew where he was going. And there was a little old lady sitting by the side of the road, still rubbing her feet and all dusty and everything. And she looked up and said, "Oh, hello, young man. How are you doing today?" And the young lad stopped and said, "Hello, grandmother. How are you? You're rubbing your feet. Has it been a long journey?" "Oh, yes, it has been there, young man." "Well, if you don't mind me asking, what do you have in that bag of yours?" "Oh, you should see it," he said. "It's the finest peach in all the land." And she said, "Well, do you mind if I take a look?" And he said, "Certainly, no problem." And he came up to the little old lady, and he opened up the bag, and she peeked inside it. And inside, there was a peach, and it was the most beautiful peach in all the land. And she looked at it, and he looked at her, and she looked at him and said, "My, oh my, isn't that something special?" And he said, "Yes, it is, and I'm going to go take it to the king, and I'm going to get the princess's hand in marriage." Says, "You are you?" "Now, well, tell you what, I have this flute for you, and I think you might need it. It might come in handy for you. So stick it inside your cloak, and I think that you'll find that it'll go a long ways to making your wish come true." So the young man said, "Thank you," as young polite men do, and down the road he went. And he got to the king's castle. He stood in the line with all the rest of the suitors, and made his way around to the king's throne, and he got his turn in front of the king. The king looked at him and says, "Young man," says, "what do you have in that bag for me?" He says, "Sire, I have the world's finest peach, the finest peach in all the land." Well, do you mind if I see it? And with that, the youngest son opened up the bag. And the king looked down inside the bag, and the king's eyes grew wide. For certainly inside that bag was the world's finest looking peach he had ever seen. And the young man went and picked up that peach and he held it in front of the king, and the king could smell it. And he looked at it, and the king's cheeks started to glow. He started getting little beads of sweat on his forehead, and his chin was starting to get wet from the drool. Oh, he was excited. He wanted to eat that peach. And he looked at the young man and said, do you mind if I taste it? Oh, well, certainly, sire. It's all for you. And so the king grabbed the peach, and it was a pretty big peach. And he took a bite. He closed his eyes, and you could hear the sigh. You could see his body relax. And then all of a sudden his eyes opened up wide, and he giggled a little bit, and he laughed. He said, that has to be the finest peach I've ever eaten, the finest peach in all the land. Well, a quiet hush went over the whole castle, from the scullery maids and the cooks to the chambermaids to the queen, the princess. Everybody stopped to look at the king. He still had this radiant look on his face. He was still just so in awe. But what struck them was, he said, that was the world's finest peach. There was a mountain of peach pits next to that throne, all the peaches he was eating. And they just knew that the moment had finally come. And the princess looked at that young man and thought, what a fine-looking young man he is. But the king, he caught himself. He thought, oh no, I just gave away my princess for a peach? Look at this, he's just this dusty young man. There's no way I'm going to have that happen. But he straightened up and he looked at the young man and says, well, young man, you most certainly did bring in the world's finest peach. I've never had a peach quite like that. I have a task set before you. I have to make sure you're truly the one to earn my daughter's hand in marriage. For the next 4 days, I'm going to have you in the morning go out into the field with my herd of 12,000 rabbits, and you have to bring them back in every night. And if there is one rabbit missing, I'm sorry, the deal is off. I said, well, certainly, sire. It's your kingdom, your rules. I'm glad to go ahead and give it a try. So the next morning, the sun came up, and the young man went out into the field, and the keeper of the rabbits let loose 12,000 rabbits into that field. And they went skipping and jumping and running, and they were suddenly they were everywhere. Everywhere and nowhere, here, there, and gone. Well, the young man didn't think too much about that. So rabbits being rabbits, they're going to be jumping and hopping and going all sorts of places. So he found his way across the field, and he sat down underneath the tree and making little things out of leaves of grass. He took himself a nap. Not too long, later the sun goes down, and so he gets out that little flute, and he decides to play a little tune on it. Well, that's when the magic really started, because all the rabbits came in out of everywhere, and they got in line, and they got in rows, and as the young man marched his way over towards the castle, all the rabbits came up from behind him, and they all walked through the gate together. Well, the royal rabbit counter, he counted those rabbits one by one, and sure enough, he found all 12,000 rabbits there in that little bunch behind the boy. And the king was like, well, that didn't work the way I wanted it to work. Well, he thought really long and hard about what he could possibly do. And the next day, when the sun came up and the young man went off into the field with the 12,000 rabbits, of course the rabbits dispersed just the way they did the day before, he called for his daughter. Says, now, I know you're the princess of the land here, but I need you to help me here. I need you to go out into the field, and I need you to get one of those rabbits and bring it back in. Well, certainly, father. The princess was game, but at the same time, it's like, I kind of like that guy. He's really a pretty sweet fellow. But she dressed up, in a scullery maid's outfit, and she went out into the field. She saw the young man sitting underneath a tree, and he was just relaxing, and the rabbits were skipping and jumping all over him. And she walked up and says, young man, I was wondering, could I buy a rabbit from you?" And the young man looked up and he immediately saw through the disguise, but of course he says, "Well, I'm so sorry, but no, these rabbits aren't for sale." He says, "Well, are you certain?" I said, "I really want one of these rabbits." He says, "Well, I'll tell you what, you have to earn it." "Earn it? Certainly, what do you want me to do?" And well, I'm going to kiss you 7 times on the lips and you're going to kiss me 7 times back. Well, the princess, she didn't know what to think about that. And her cheeks got all rosy and red, but she says, "A bargain's a bargain." So he stood up and they kissed back and forth till they got the 7 kisses each way out of the way. And he gave her a rabbit, and she turned around and went back to the castle. Well, so he was getting ready to go down. He got out his flute and he started playing. And all the rabbits came running, including the one that was in the princess's arms. It jumped out of her arms and went running out into the field and got in line with the rest of the rabbits. And the young man and the 12,000 rabbits came walking in through the gate. And they made their way in, and the royal rabbit counter, dun 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 dun, counted them all up, and sure enough, there was all 12,000. Well, now the king was he was fuming. He was thinking, "God, this is not working the way that I wanted it to work." So the next morning, the sun came up, and the young man went out in the field again, with all 12,000 rabbits taking off and going in all sorts of directions. The king called for his wife, the queen. The queen came up before and said, "Yes, sire, this is why I need you to go out and get one of those rabbits. Do what you have to do, but bring one of those rabbits back in the castle today, now." Well, so the queen dressed up in some costume or another, and she went out in the field. And sure enough, there was the young man sitting underneath the tree, and he was goofing around, making daisy chains or what have you. And she walked up and looked at the young man and says, "Young man, I want to buy a rabbit." And the young man looked up and saw through her costume and says, "Well, I'm so sorry, but these rabbits aren't for sale." And the queen looked down at him and says, "Why? Really, tell me, what does it take to get one of your rabbits?" And he looked at her and said, "Well, I think you can earn one." And she looked down and says, "Earn one? Well, certainly. What does it take to earn one of your rabbits?" It's like, "Well, I need you to stand on your head for the count of 3. Well, the queen didn't know what to think about that, and she got on her head, rather on her hands, and stood on her head, and her petticoats are showing, and she got really embarrassed. By the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. She got up and she took a rabbit and she went back to the castle. She went high, high, high up into the highest tower. And she locked that rabbit in the highest tower. So try to get out of that one. Well, the day went by. The sun was going down. The young man got out the flute and he started playing. And all the rabbits came running and they all got in line and they got in rows. And the young man was walking his way towards the castle when the final rabbit up in the highest tower crawled through the window and jumped and made his way in line with the rest of the rabbits. They all came into the castle. The young man and the 12,000 rabbits and the royal rabbit counter counted all of them, and sure enough, they were all there. Well, now the king was just, "Forget it. I'm tired of leaving this to everybody else to solve. I'm going to take care of this myself." So the next morning, the sun came up and the young man went out in the field with his 12,000 rabbits. The king got into a disguise and he jumped on a donkey and he went off into the field. And the young man was sitting under his shade tree and the rabbits were jumping around and they were all having a good time. And the king got off his donkey and he looked at the young man and says, "Young man, I want to buy one of your rabbits." Well, the young man looked at the king, knew who he was, saw him through the disguise, and said, "Well, certainly." I was like, "But these rabbits aren't for sale." "Well, that's okay. You name your price. Tell me what I have to do to earn one of these rabbits." He says, "Well, that's exactly it. You have to earn one of these rabbits." "Well, tell me, what is it I have to do?" "Well, what you need to do is you need to kiss your donkey on the lips." Well, the king was flabbergasted, but and he was flustered, and he was starting to sweat, and he said, "Kiss my donkey on the lips." But he knew that he wanted one of those rabbits. So he turned and he looked at his donkey, and he gave that donkey a big old kiss on the lips. Mwah! And he took a rabbit, and he went on back to the castle. He went right into the kitchen. He went to the head cook and says, "I have a real terrible hunger for rabbit fricassee, and I want you to prepare it for me right now. Use this rabbit and get to work." Well, the cook said, "Certainly, sire." And he went and dispatched the rabbit and took the skin off, and he was just getting ready to pop him in the pot. The sun went down and the boy was on the flute, and suddenly all the rabbits came running, including the one that was getting ready to go in the pot. And that rabbit jumped back into his skin, and then he jumped out of the cook's arms, went running down the way, and he got in line with the rest of the rabbits. They all came marching in to the castle. And the royal rabbit counter, well, what do you think? Did he get all those rabbits in that line? He did. 12,000 of them. Well, at this point, the young man and the king were standing toe to toe, nose to nose, and it's like, okay, you've done it. You've managed to round up these rabbits 4 days in a row. And the young man said, well, certainly, sire. So that's what you asked me to do, and I did it. Well, I don't know whether or not that's really what it's going to take for me to give you my daughter's hand in marriage. He says, well, sire, I'm so sorry. You gave me a task. I fulfilled my duty. And a bargain's a bargain. If we can't seem to come to terms with this, I think we need to go before the judges and then have them decide. And the king says, certainly, we'll do that tomorrow. He says, but sire, before we go there, I need for you to give me 3 bags. 3 bags, the largest burlap bags you can possibly spare. What do you need burlap bags for? Those? Well, those are going to be the bags of truth. And the next morning, the king and the queen and the princess and the young man all gathered before 4 judges, some of the smartest, most philosophical men in the kingdom. And they looked down at the little party there, and they said, well, young man, it's like we hear from the king that you fulfilled your task, but we want to make sure certainly that you did it correctly and that you really do deserve the princess's hand in marriage. Well, the young man looked, says, well, then I will bring my witnesses before me, and then they will let you know whether or not my claim is true. I want to call for the princess. Well, the young man stood there, and the princess came forward, and he looked at the princess. Princess, now tell the truth. Did you or did you not exchange 7 kisses with me both ways? Well, she suddenly started to get really red and hot and started to giggle a little bit. Oh, yes, I did. We exchanged 7 kisses each. Jump in the bag of truth. So she jumped inside the sack, closed it up around herself. And then the man called for the queen. Queen stood before him and says, Your Majesty, I have a question for you, and you must tell the truth. She looked at him and says, did you or did you not stand on your head for the count of 3? And the queen started getting red and getting redder, the red one went all the way up to her crimson crown. As she thought about how she stood on her head, her petticoat showed, and she said, oh, yes, and I did stand on my head for a count of 3. Then get into the bag of truth. And so the queen took one of the bags and pulled it up around her, and she stood next to the daughter. So the young man calls for the king. Sire, I have a question to ask you, and when I ask you this question, you must tell the truth. The king looked at the young man and says, go ahead. Sire, did you or did you not? And you have to tell the truth. Kiss? Oh yes. Oh, you know what? Guess what? I think you're going to be the most fabulous son-in-law a king could ever have. Yes, I'm going to marry you off to my daughter today, said the king. And sure enough, that's what happened. The princess climbed out of the bag and embraced the young man and the king and the queen and the princess. And the young man went off to the church, and it's all history now. So the young man grew to be a fine counselor, and before you know it, his time came to be king, and the young man and the princess ruled for years and years and years. And as for the king, and he actually did kiss those lips, kiss the donkey on the lips, and no one ever knew with the young man, and he was good about keeping his word. Snip, snap, snout. That tale is told out.